The generator outside the execution chamber at Louisiana State Penitentiary, known to the inmates simply as Angola, did not hum. It shuddered. It was a low, mechanical cough that vibrated through the concrete floor of Block E, shaking the iron bars and rattling the teeth of the condemned. It was shortly after midnight on October 16, 1955. The air in the death house was thick, heavy with the scent of the nearby Mississippi River and the sharper, more clinical smell of antiseptic pine cleaner used to mop the floor around gruesome Gertie, the oak electric chair that sat waiting in the center of the room. In cell 280, the woman whom the newspapers had christened the White Rose of Louisiana sat on the edge of a narrow steel cot. Her name was Isabella Dubois, though for the last 76 days, the state of Louisiana had referred to her only by her prisoner number. She was 40 years old, but in the dim yellow light of the single naked bulb hanging from the ceiling, she looked ancient. Her once famous blonde hair, which had graced the society pages of the New Orleans Times-Picayune for a decade, had been sheared close to her scalp, leaving jagged tufts of pale gray that exposed the delicate curve of her neck. She wore a dress of rough gray denim, 2 sizes too big, which hung off her emaciated frame like a shroud. She was not screaming. She was not begging for the governor to call. She was not bargaining with God. While the other men on the row paced their cages or wept into their hands, Isabella sat with a terrifying stillness. On her lap, balanced on a piece of cardboard, was a sheet of prison-issue paper and a stub of a pencil. She was writing. Her hand moved with a steady, fluid grace that seemed entirely out of place in this concrete tomb. She was writing a letter to her sister-in-law, a final testament that would not be discovered for 20 years. In it, she did not speak of the injustice of her trial or the cruelty of the mob that bayed for her blood outside the prison gates. She wrote of forgiveness. She wrote to her son Leo, the boy who had been ripped from her arms, pleading with him not to seek vengeance for what was about to happen. "My darling," she wrote, the graphite digging into the coarse paper, "do not carry the weight of their hate. It is too heavy a burden for a child. I'm going to a place where the noise stops. Be good, be kind, and remember that your mother loved you more than her own life." To understand how Isabella Dubois traveled the backward path from the most powerful woman in the South to a shorn prisoner waiting for the switch to be thrown, we have to look away from the chair. We have to look back to the world that made her, and the world that decided it had to destroy her. The fall of the House of Dubois began not with a bang, but with the slow, suffocating heat of a Louisiana summer. In 1955, Belle Reve was more than a plantation. It was the seat of a political empire. Located 30 miles upriver from New Orleans, it was a sprawling estate of white columns and manicured azalea gardens that seemed to float above the swamps like a mirage. Isabella presided over this kingdom with a charm that was both intoxicating and impenetrable. She was not a native Southerner. She was a transplant from the East Coast, an outsider with old money and a refined accent that the local wives mimicked but secretly despised. She had married Senator Henri Dubois, the kingfish of the bayou, a populous firebrand who promised chicken in every pot while lining his own pockets with oil money. For years, Isabella was the ornament of Henri's power. She threw the parties that sealed the deals. She wore the silks that the sharecroppers' wives stared at with a mixture of awe and venom. But beneath the surface, the resentment was boiling. The heat in Louisiana does things to people. It ferments anger. The poor whites and the disenfranchised laborers saw Henri as their savior, but they saw Isabella as the leech. She was the foreigner, the spendthrift, the woman who ordered ice sculptures from New Orleans while their children walked barefoot on the burning asphalt. When the economy dipped and the corruption scandals began to leak into the papers, the public didn't blame Henri. They blamed her. They whispered that she was the one pulling the strings, the Lady Macbeth of the Delta. The inciting incident came on a sweltering night in August. Senator Dubois was found dead in his study at Belle Reve, a single gunshot wound to the chest. The murder weapon, a pearl-handled revolver, was lying on the Persian rug. It was Isabella's gun. The official story, the one the police and the coroner pieced together later, was full of holes. There were rumors of a shadowy business partner seen leaving the estate, of gambling debts, of political rivals. But the mob didn't want a complex investigation. They wanted a villain. And they found her standing at the top of the grand staircase, wearing a silk dressing gown stained with her husband's blood, staring blankly at the chaos below. The arrest was not a legal procedure, it was an invasion. The sun had not yet risen when the sheriff's convoy tore up the gravel driveway of Belle Reve, their sirens screaming, shattering the morning mist. They didn't knock. They kicked in the heavy oak doors. Isabella was in the nursery clutching her 8-year-old son Leo. This was the moment the queen died and the mother began her long agony. Leo was a fragile child, terrified of loud noises. When the deputies stormed the room, muddy boots trampling the plush carpet, he buried his face in Isabella's neck. "It's all right, Leo," she whispered, her voice trembling only slightly. "It's just a mistake. Be brave for Mama." But there was no bravery in what followed. The deputies didn't just arrest her, they tore them apart. One large officer grabbed Isabella by the hair, dragging her backward. Another snatched Leo. "No, he's only a child!" Isabella screamed, a sound that shredded her throat. It was the same primal cry that Marie Antoinette had uttered when the revolutionaries came for the Dauphin. "Don't touch him! Let him go!" Leo kicked and wailed, his small hands reaching for her. "Mama! Mama!" The last image Isabella had of her son was his terrified face, red and wet with tears, being carried out the door like a sack of flour. The door slammed shut, severing the bond that had kept her sane. The silence that rushed into the room was louder than the sirens. She was handcuffed, still in her blood-stained robe, and dragged down the stairs. Outside, the news cameras were already waiting. The flashbulbs popped like lightning, capturing her disheveled hair, her wild eyes. The photos ran the next morning with the headline, "The Black Widow of Belle Reve." The narrative was set. She wasn't a grieving widow. She was a monster who had killed the people's hero. Isabella was not taken to the local county jail due to security concerns, a euphemism for the mob of angry constituents gathering with torches and pitchforks. She was transferred directly to the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, but she wasn't put in the general population. She was placed in Block X, a dank subterranean isolation wing usually reserved for the mentally ill and the irredeemable. Parisians had called the Conciergerie the antechamber of the Guillotine. Block X was the waiting room of hell. There was no luxury here, no silk sheets, no ice sculptures. Her cell, number 280, was a 6x8 concrete box that smelled of mildew, urine, and the swamp water that seeped through the cracks in the foundation whenever the river rose. The humidity was oppressive, a physical weight that made the walls sweat. Her bed was a thin stain mattress on a steel frame. Her toilet was a bucket in the corner, but the worst torture wasn't the filth. It was the eyes. Just as the French revolutionaries had refused to let their queen have a moment of privacy, placing guards inside her room, the warden of Angola ordered that Isabella be under suicide watch. This meant that 2 male guards were stationed directly outside the bars of her cell, 24 hours a day. There was no screen to hide behind, no curtain. Isabella had to eat, sleep, and use the bucket while 2 men watched, smoking cigarettes and playing cards, their eyes flicking over her body with a mixture of lust and contempt. "Hey, Duchess," one of them, a thick-necked man named Earl, would sneer. "Where's your fancy perfume now? You smell just like the rest of us." They stripped her of her name. She was no longer Mrs. Dubois, she was 280. They stripped her of her dignity. When she arrived, she was subjected to a cavity search that was less an inspection and more a sanctioned assault performed by a matron with rough hands and cold eyes. They took her wedding ring. They took the locket with Leo's picture. "Contraband," the matron had said, dropping the locket into a plastic bag. "Please," Isabella had whispered the first time she had begged. "It's all I have of him. You should have thought of that before you pulled the trigger, honey." The days bled into weeks. Time became meaningless, measured only by the changing of the guard shifts and the clanging of metal doors. The heat in Block X was suffocating. Isabella's skin, once pampered with expensive creams, broke out in rashes from the rough denim and the insect bites. Rats, bold and fat from the prison garbage, skittered across the floor at night, their claws clicking on the concrete. Yet, in this cauldron of humiliation, something unexpected began to happen. The guards, Earl and his partner Big Jim, expected Isabella to break. They expected the spoiled rich girl to scream, to throw tantrums, to demand special treatment. They wanted her to be the caricature the newspapers had painted, hysterical, arrogant, guilty. But Isabella didn't break. She sat on her cot, back straight, hands folded in her lap. When they threw her food tray on the floor, a slop of grits and congealed gravy, she didn't complain. She knelt down and cleaned it up with a rag, eating what she could to stay alive. When they taunted her about her husband, asking if she enjoyed watching him bleed out, she simply looked through them, her eyes fixed on a spot on the far wall. She was bending the pain into armor. She realized that they wanted a show. They wanted the white rose to wither in the mud so they could feel superior. By refusing to react, by maintaining a terrifying, icy composure, she was denying them their satisfaction. She was turning her cell into a throne room. Her only lifeline was a young cleaning girl named Rose, a shy African-American woman who came to mop the corridor every morning. Rose was the only person who didn't look at Isabella with hatred. One morning, while mopping near the bars, Rose whispered, keeping her head down so the guards wouldn't see. "They say your boy is okay, ma'am. They say he's with a foster family in Baton Rouge." Isabella moved to the bars, her hands gripping the cold iron. "Leo, is he safe?" "I hear he's quiet," Rose whispered, scrubbing the same spot of concrete. "Doesn't talk much, but he's alive." Tears welled in Isabella's eyes, hot and stinging. It was the first time she had shown emotion in weeks. "Thank you, Rose." "God bless you." "Hey!" Big Jim shouted from his desk. "No talking to the prisoner. You want to end up in a cell next to her." Rose hurried away, head bowed. But that scrap of news was enough. Leo was alive. It was the ember that kept Isabella from sliding into the darkness. But the world outside had not moved on. It was gathering momentum. The trial was scheduled for October 14th. The prosecutor, a man named Ellis Thorne, was a political climber who saw Isabella's execution as his ticket to the governor's mansion. He didn't just want a conviction. He wanted a spectacle. He knew the evidence against her regarding the murder was circumstantial at best. The gun had her prints, but she lived in the house. Of course, her prints were on it. There were no witnesses. Thorne needed something more. He needed something that would make the jury, 12 white men from the rural parishes, so revulsed that they would pull the switch themselves. He needed to destroy her character. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Isabella sensed the shift in the prison atmosphere. The guards stopped taunting her and started watching her with a strange, morbid curiosity. The newspapers, which occasionally made their way into the block, grew more vicious. They weren't just calling her a murderer anymore. They were calling her a deviant. A corrupter of innocence. Isabella didn't know what was coming. She spent her nights staring at the single candle the warden allowed her, a small mercy granted only so the guards could see her better in the dark. In the flickering flame, she replayed the memories of Belle Reve, not the parties or the politics, but the quiet moments. Leo chasing fireflies in the garden, Henri reading by the fire before the ambition ate his soul. She wondered when they had stopped being a family and started being a target. On the morning of October 14th, 1955, the steel door of Block X groaned open. It was time. Isabella stood up. She smoothed the wrinkles of her gray dress. She had lost so much weight that the fabric bunched around her waist. She splashed cold water on her face from the basin. "Let's go, Duchess," Big Jim said. He sounded almost subdued. Even he seemed to sense the heaviness of the day. They handcuffed her wrists. Not in front, but behind her back, forcing her shoulders into a painful arch. She was led out of the darkness of the block and into the blinding Louisiana sun. A police van waited to take her to the courthouse in St. Francisville. As she stepped into the light, she blinked, her eyes unaccustomed to the brightness. The drive took an hour. Through the wire mesh windows, she saw the swamps passing by, the cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, looking like weeping widows. She saw the shacks of the sharecroppers, the people who hated her. When the van arrived at the courthouse, the noise hit her first. It was a roar, a wall of sound. Murderer. Witch. Burn her. Thousands of people packed the town square. They hung from lampposts, stood on car roofs, pressed against the police barricades. They threw rotten tomatoes, eggs, and clumps of mud at the van. Isabella sat inside, flinching as the objects thudded against the metal. This was the public humiliation. The mob didn't just want justice. They wanted to see her dragged through the dirt. She was led into the courtroom through a back entrance, but the gallery was already packed. The air inside was stiflingly hot, smelling of sweat, tobacco, and hair tonic. Ceiling fans spun lazily, doing nothing to cut the heat. When Isabella entered, the room went silent for a heartbeat, then erupted in murmurs. They expected a monster. They expected a weeping, broken woman. What they saw was a ghost. Isabella walked to the defendant's table with her head high. She looked pale, her cheekbones sharp as glass, her gray dress stark against the dark wood of the court. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the judge. She sat down and folded her hands. Prosecutor Thorne stood up. He was a small man with a booming voice, wearing a white linen suit that seemed too bright for the grim occasion. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief, "we are here not just to punish a crime, but to exorcise an evil." The trial was a farce. Witnesses were paraded out. Former maids who claimed Isabella hated her husband, political rivals who claimed she was a communist sympathizer, shopkeepers who claimed she was rude. It was a litany of petty grievances elevated to capital offenses. Isabella watched it all with a detached curiosity. It felt like they were talking about a stranger, but Thorne had saved his ace for the final day. "Your Honor," Thorne boomed, "the state calls a special witness, a witness who has seen the true darkness of the defendant's soul." The doors opened. A social worker walked in, and holding her hand was Leo. Isabella gasped. It was the first sound she had made in 2 days. "Leo!" He looked smaller than she remembered. He was wearing a suit that was too big for him. His eyes were wide, terrified, darting around the room until they landed on her. He didn't run to her. He flinched. Isabella tried to stand, but the bailiff pushed her down. "Sit down, prisoner." Thorne approached the boy. He knelt down, putting on a mask of fatherly concern. "Leo, son," Thorne said softly into the microphone, "do you remember what you told me in my office about what your mother used to do? About the games she made you play?" The courtroom went dead silent. The air grew heavy, charged with a dark, prurient electricity. Leo looked at Thorne, then at his mother. He looked like a trapped animal. He had been coached. Isabella could see it in his eyes, the fear, the confusion. They had twisted something innocent into something monstrous. Leo's voice was a whisper. "She made me sleep in her bed." "And?" Thorne prodded. "Did she touch you, Leo? Did she touch you in ways a mother shouldn't?" Isabella felt the world tilt. This was the incest accusation, the ultimate taboo. They weren't satisfied with calling her a murderer. They had to make her a pervert. They had to strip her of the one title she held sacred, mother. Leo began to cry. He didn't answer. He just sobbed. "Let the record show the witnesses distraught," Thorne said, standing up triumphantly. "The state rests." A wave of revulsion swept through the jury. The men looked at Isabella not with anger, but with disgust. Isabella sat frozen. Her heart felt like it had been ripped out of her chest. They had used her son. They had weaponized his innocence to destroy her. The judge looked at her. "Does the defense have anything to say?" Isabella's lawyer, a court-appointed alcoholic who had barely spoken to her, started to stand. But Isabella stood up first. She ignored the bailiff. She ignored the judge. She turned her back on the bench and faced the gallery. She scanned the faces until she found the women, the wives of the farmers, the mothers of the town. "I have no words for the men in this room," Isabella said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried to the back of the room. It was clear, cultured, and shaking with a raw, visceral pain. "But I appeal to the mothers. I appeal to every woman who has ever held a child. Look at my son. Look at his face. Do you see a victim? Or do you see a child who has been tortured by grown men to say things he doesn't understand? Nature refuses this charge. I appeal to the conscience of every mother here." For a second, the heat in the room seemed to break. A few women in the back row lowered their eyes. Some shifted uncomfortably. The monstrous caricature had vanished, replaced by a mother defending her child. But it was too late. The die was cast. Thorne slammed his hand on the table. "Objection! The prisoner is addressing the gallery." "Sustain!" the judge barked. "Sit down, Mrs. Dubois, or you will be bound and gagged." Isabella sat. She didn't look at Leo again. She couldn't bear to see his shame. She knew then that it was over. The verdict was a formality. The jury deliberated for 45 minutes. Guilty. First-degree murder. The sentence, death by electrocution. When the judge read the words, Isabella didn't flinch. She simply nodded as if acknowledging a dinner reservation. "Is that all?" she asked softly. She was led back to the van. The crowd outside cheered. They danced in the streets. Isabella was returned to Block X. The waiting room became the departure lounge. She had 72 hours left. Back in cell 280, the silence returned. But it was different now. It was the silence of the end. She asked for a pen and paper. She sat on the edge of the bed. She began to write. My darling Leo. Fond 2. The execution. Kuak Han quiet. The ink on the page was cheap, bleeding slightly into the pulp of the prison stationery as the humidity in Block X rose with the morning sun. Isabella Dubois wrote until her fingers cramped, pouring her soul onto the paper while the 2 guards outside her cell played a game of gin rummy, the slap of the cards providing a rhythmic counterpoint to her scratching pencil. She wrote of the azaleas at Belle Rive, which would be blooming now. She wrote of the smell of rain on the bayou. She wrote to Leo not as a prisoner, but as a mother, crafting a map of love that she hoped would guide him out of the labyrinth of shame the state had built around him. Do not let them make you hard, Leo, she wrote. Hardness is not strength. It is brittle. It breaks. Be like the water. Flow around the rocks. Keep moving. When she finished, she folded the letter into a small, tight square. She didn't have an envelope. She didn't have a stamp. She knew that if she gave it to Big Jim or Earl, it would end up in the trash, or worse, pinned to the bulletin board in the break room for the guards to laugh at. She needed a courier. Isabella waited until the shift change at 6 a.m. The heavy steel door at the end of the corridor clanked open, and Rose, the cleaning girl, pushed her mop bucket into the block. Rose's eyes were swollen, red-rimmed. She moved slowly, dragging the mop like a cross. When Rose reached cell 280, she didn't look up. The new guards were watching, but as she swished the soapy water near the bars, Isabella moved. She didn't speak. Speaking was dangerous. She simply slid her hand through the bars, palm down, and dropped the folded square of paper into the dirty water of the mop bucket. It was a gamble, a desperate, reckless gamble. Rose didn't flinch. She didn't pause. She simply dipped the mop back into the bucket, swirling the water, burying the paper under the gray suds. Then she wrung the mop out, shielding the bucket with her body, and moved to the next cell. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. A silent contract was signed. The letter was safe. The final countdown began at noon on October 16th. The warden of Angola, a stern, thick-set man named Cajun Bob LeBlanc, arrived at the cell with a priest. LeBlanc was not a cruel man by nature, but he was a bureaucrat of death. He viewed executions as a logistical challenge, a problem of voltage, amperage, and disposal. Isabella, LeBlanc said, using her name for the first time since she arrived. It's time to prepare. Isabella stood. She had not slept. She felt light, almost ethereal, as if her body were already dissolving into mist. I am ready, Warden. We have to. There are procedures. LeBlanc stammered slightly. He gestured to the barber standing behind him, a trembling inmate named T-Boy, who clutched a pair of clippers and a straight razor. Isabella looked at the clippers. She touched her short, graying hair. Is this necessary? You already cut it when I arrived. The electrode, LeBlanc said, looking at the floor. It needs contact, skin to metal, to ensure a clean conduction. It was the science of death, masquerading as protocol. But to Isabella, it was the final stripping away of her vanity. The Marie Antoinette parallel was absolute. The queen had her locks shorn to clear the neck for the blade. The politician's wife would have her scalp shaved to welcome the lightning. She sat on the wooden stool in the center of the cell. T-Boy's hands shook so badly he nicked her ear twice. Isabella didn't flinch. She sat with her eyes closed, listening to the buzz of the clippers, feeling the cool air hit her naked scalp. Tufts of hair, the last remnants of the blonde that had once dazzled the governor's ball, fell onto the concrete floor, mixing with the dust and the cigarette ash flicked by the guards. When it was done, she ran a hand over her head. It was smooth, bristly. She looked like a penitent nun or a cancer patient at the end of the road. You have a choice of clothes, LeBlanc said. You can wear the prison grays, or... He gestured to a pile of clothes on the cot. Your family sent these. It was a white cotton dress, simple, cheap, the kind of dress a farm girl would wear to a Sunday picnic. It wasn't hers. It was something her sister-in-law must have bought at a department store, thinking it looked innocent. I will wear the white, Isabella said. She changed behind the open bars. The guards watched, but their leers were gone. There is no lust in the face of the condemned, only a morbid, creeping dread. She pulled the white dress over her head. It was loose, billowing slightly in the draft from the fan. Without her hair, without her jewelry, wearing the white of a ghost, she looked almost translucent. At 2 airtight p.m., the procession began. Unlike modern executions where the death row is attached to the chamber, in 1955 Angola, the electric chair, Gruesome Gertie, was housed in the Red Hat block, a mile across the sprawling prison farm. They didn't put her in a closed van. The warden claimed the prison van had a flat tire. The truth was darker. The press was waiting at the gates of the Red Hat. The state wanted them to see her. They loaded her onto the back of a flatbed farm truck. Isabella sat on a wooden bench bolted to the bed of the truck. Her wrists were bound behind her back with heavy leather straps. Her ankles were shackled. Flanking her were 2 armed guards with shotguns. The truck roared to life, spewing black smoke. It began to roll slowly down the dirt road that bisected the prison fields. This was The Walk, reimagined as a Southern Gothic nightmare. The sun was high and merciless, beating down on Isabella's shaved head. The heat waves shimmered off the cotton fields. On either side of the road, hundreds of inmates, men in black and white stripes, stopped their work. They leaned on their hose. They wiped sweat from their brows. They watched the truck pass. They didn't jeer. They didn't shout insults like the mob insane. Francisville. These men knew what waited at the end of the road. They took off their hats, a sea of shaved heads bowing to a shaved head. It was a silent, rolling funeral. The only sound was the crunch of tires on gravel and the distant cry of a crow. Isabella sat perfectly straight. The wind whipped the skirt of her white dress. She didn't look at the prisoners. She looked at the horizon where the Mississippi River glittered like a knife edge. She was thinking of the cart ride of the French Queen. She wondered if Marie Antoinette felt this same strange, detached peace. The fear was gone. The hope was gone. All that was left was the moment. "Keep your eyes forward, 280, a guard muttered, shifting his shotgun. "I am looking at the river," Isabella replied softly. "It's the last time I'll see it." The truck turned the final corner. The Red Hat building loomed, a low brick fortress surrounded by barbed wire. But outside the gates, the scene changed. The silence of the fields was replaced by the roar of the free world. A crowd had gathered, not just reporters, but the public. The angry citizens who felt cheated by the Dubois corruption. They pressed against the chain-link fence, screaming, waving signs. "Burn the witch! Justice for Henri! Die, traitor!" Some threw rotten vegetables over the fence. A tomato struck the side of the truck, exploding in a red splatter near Isabella's feet. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She turned her head slowly and looked at them. Her face was gaunt, her skull bare, her eyes huge and dark. She looked like a concentration camp survivor, a specter of suffering. The scream of a woman in the front row died in her throat. The crowd faltered. It is easy to hate a monster in a newspaper. It is much harder to hate a broken, fragile human being staring at you from the back of a truck. Isabella's gaze wasn't angry. It was pitying. She looked at them as if they were the ones in chains. "Forgive them," she whispered to herself, the wind carrying the words away. "They don't know what they are doing." The truck stopped at the loading dock of the death house. The warden helped her down. His hands were shaking. "This way, Isabella." She walked into the building. The air changed instantly. It was cool, smelling of damp concrete and the terrifying metallic scent of ozone. They led her down a short green corridor. At the end of the hall, the door to the chamber was open, and there she was. Gruesome Gertie. The chair was ugly. It was made of heavy oak, dark with age and oil. Leather straps hung from the arms and legs like dead snakes. A heavy black cable ran from the back of the chair to a panel on the wall. A sponge, soaking in a bucket of saline water, sat on the floor. Isabella stopped. Her breath hitched. This was the reality. The wooden throne. "It's okay," the priest murmured, stepping beside her. "God is here. He is walking with you." Isabella nodded. She took a step forward. The witness room was separated from the chamber by a glass partition. Through the glass, she could see faces. The prosecutor, Ellis Thorne, sat in the front row, looking pale and sweaty. He wouldn't meet her eyes. A few reporters scribbled furiously in notepads. There was no family, no friends. She was dying alone. The executioner was a man named Kate Miller. He was a contract killer for the state, a man who traveled from prison to prison with his portable generator. He stood behind the chair wearing a black hood, not for anonymity, but for theater. He was adjusting the straps. Isabella walked to the chair As she turned to sit, her foot caught on the heavy rubber mat on the floor. She stumbled. She fell forward, bumping into Cap Miller. Her shoulder hit his chest. The room gasped. The guards stepped forward, hands on their batons. But Isabella steadied herself. She looked up at the hooded man. She saw his eyes through the slits, eyes that were tired, flat, devoid of malice. He was just a mechanic of death. "Pardon me, sir," Isabella said. Her voice was clear, ringing in the small, silent room. "I did not mean to do that." The apology hung in the air. It was absurd. It was polite. It was devastating. Here was a woman about to be burned alive by the state, apologizing to her executioner for stepping on his toes. Cap Miller froze. He stared at her. For a moment, the machinery of the state ground to a halt. The monster the prosecutor had painted, the incestuous, murderous witch, evaporated. In her place stood a lady with manners, even at the edge of the abyss. That's all right, ma'am," Miller mumbled, his voice muffled by the hood. He stepped back. He gestured to the chair. Isabella sat down. The wood was hard. She settled herself, smoothing the skirt of her white dress over her knees. "I'm ready," she said. The guards moved in. They strapped her arms. The leather bit into her skin. They strapped her chest. They strapped her ankles. Cap Miller picked up the wet sponge. He placed it on her shaved head. It was cold, water trickling down her neck like tears. Then came the helmet. A leather cap with a copper electrode inside. He buckled it under her chin. It forced her head back, making her look up at the ceiling. Then the black hood was dropped over her face. The world went dark. Isabella was alone in the void. She could hear the breathing of the witnesses. She could hear the hum of the generator powering up, the mechanical cough rising to a whine. "Does the prisoner have any final words?" the warden asked. Isabella's voice came from under the hood, muffled but steady. "Tell my son I love him. Tell him I went to the river." And then she started to hum. It wasn't a hymn. It wasn't a prayer. It was a lullaby. The song she used to sing to Leo when the thunderstorms rolled in off the Gulf. "Hush, little baby. Don't say a word." The warden looked at the clock. 3:05 p.m. He nodded to Cap Miller. Miller reached for the lever on the wall panel. His hand hesitated for a fraction of a second, the weight of her apology still on his boot. Then he pulled it. The sound was like a whip crack. A massive thunk. 2,000 volts of electricity surged through the copper wire. Isabella's body arched against the straps. The leather creaked violently. Her hands clenched into fists, knuckles turning white. Smoke began to curl from beneath the helmet, a thin gray wisp that smelled of burning hair and scorched flesh. The hum of the generator dropped in pitch as the load hit. For 10 seconds, the current flowed. Then Miller cut it. Isabella slumped back into the chair. She was still. The doctor stepped forward. He put a stethoscope to her chest. He listened. He frowned. "Strong heart," he whispered. "Still beating." A murmur of horror went through the witness room. Ellis Thorne looked like he was going to be sick. "Hit her again," the warden ordered, his voice tight. Miller pulled the lever again. Another surge. Another violent arching of the body. The smell grew stronger, filling the room, clinging to the clothes of the witnesses. It was the smell of a barbecue, terrible and undeniable. This time, the current ran for 15 seconds. When it stopped, Isabella hung limp in the straps. Her head lolled forward. The doctor checked again. "Time of death," he announced, checking his watch. 3:08 p.m. The warden let out a breath he had been holding. "Clear the room." The witnesses filed out, shaken, silent. They walked out into the bright Louisiana sun, but the world looked different. The colors seemed muted. The victory they had come to see felt like ash in their mouths. Ellis Thorne walked to his car. A reporter shouted, "Mr. Thorne, do you feel justice was done today?" Thorne stopped. He looked back at the Red Hat building, where a plume of smoke was dissipating from the vent. "Justice?" Thorne muttered. "I don't know, but I know I'll never hear a lullaby again without shaking." The body of Isabella Dubois was not claimed by family. Her husband was dead. Her son was in the system. Her in-laws washed their hands of her. She was placed in a plain pine box filled with sawdust to absorb the fluids. Usually, executed prisoners were buried in the prison cemetery, Point Lookout, under a white cross with a number, but the warden had a final order from the governor. "Bury her in the swamp," the order read. "Unmarked. We don't want a shrine." That night, under the cover of darkness, a truck drove to the edge of the prison property, where the solid ground gave way to the black water of the Atchafalaya swamp. Two trustees, inmates earning good time, dug a hole in the mud. They lowered the box. Before they filled it in, one of the inmates, an old lifer named Preacher, took off his hat. "She said sorry to the man who killed her," Preacher whispered. "That ain't natural. That's grace." He threw a handful of dirt on the box. "Rest easy, Duchess." The swamp swallowed her. The mud closed over the pine. The cypress trees stood guard, their roots tangling around the grave, hiding it from history. Isabella Dubois was gone. The state of Louisiana erased her name. They sealed the records of the trial. They sent Leo to a family in Texas who changed his name to Lee. They thought they had buried the scandal. They thought the white rose would rot and be forgotten, but they forgot about the letter floating in the dirty water of Rose's mop bucket. Rose had retrieved it. She had dried it on the radiator in the janitor's closet. She couldn't read well, but she knew it was important. She hid it in her Bible. For 20 years, the letter sat between the pages of the Book of Psalms, waiting. Fan 3. The Legacy. Die San. The morning after the execution of Isabella Dubois, the sun rose over St. Francisville with a blinding, accusatory brightness. The town woke up with a collective hangover, not from alcohol, though there had been plenty of that, but from the adrenaline of hatred. The crowds that had cheered and thrown tomatoes at the prison van were gone, leaving behind a square littered with trash, broken signs, and the lingering sour taste of a spectacle that had gone too far. The white rose was dead. The witch was burned. But as the shopkeepers swept their sidewalks and the farmers returned to their fields, there was no sense of relief. There was only a quiet, creeping shame. It was the feeling of a mob that realizes, in the cold light of day, that they have not slain a monster, but merely murdered a woman. Cap Miller, the state executioner, packed up his equipment in silence. He dismantled gruesome Gertie, coiling the heavy black cables and scrubbing the oak frame with ammonia to remove the smell of scorched flesh. He had performed 42 executions in his career. He was a man who slept soundly, but that night, and for many nights after, he would wake up sweating, hearing the soft click of heels on the concrete floor and the polite, cultured voice saying, "Pardon me, sir." The apology had lodged in his psyche like a piece of shrapnel. He resigned 3 months later, claiming his hands had developed a tremor that made him unfit for the delicate work of killing. He spent the rest of his life raising pigeons on a roof in Baton Rouge, a man trying to find peace in the flight of white birds. But the true tragedy of the Dubois affair did not end with the executioner's retirement. It continued in the life of the boy who had been left behind. Leo Dubois, 8 years old, was erased from the narrative as efficiently as his mother had been erased from the earth. The state of Louisiana, eager to wash its hands of the scandal, placed him in the foster care system under a sealed file. He was sent to a cattle ranch in West Texas, to a family named Miller, no relation to the executioner, who were paid a stipend to raise him and forget where he came from. They changed his name to Lee. They told him his parents had died in a car accident. They forbade him from asking questions about the past. But memory is a ghost that cannot be exorcised. Lee grew up haunted by nightmares of blinding camera flashes and the smell of swamp water. He was a quiet, withdrawn child who flinched at loud noises. He didn't know why he was afraid of the dark or why the sight of a white dress made him nauseous. The state had stolen his history, but they had left him with the trauma. For 20 years, the silence held. The name Isabella Dubois became a footnote in Louisiana history, a cautionary tale told to young girls about the dangers of ambition and vanity. The swamps of the Atchafalaya kept her secret, the cypress roots embracing her pine box, pulling it deeper into the mud until it was one with the geology of the delta. Then, in the humid August of 1975, the silence broke. Rose Washington, the former cleaning woman at Angola Prison, lay on her deathbed in a small shotgun house in the 9th Ward of New Orleans. She was 70 years old, her lungs failing from years of inhaling bleach and coal dust. She called her granddaughter, a young journalism student named Maya, to her bedside. "Bring me my Bible," Rose wheezed. Maya brought the heavy, leather-bound book. Rose's trembling hands opened it to the Book of Psalms. There, pressed between the pages like a dried flower, was a square of yellowed, brittle prison paper. "Read it," Rose whispered. And then, tell the truth. I carried it long enough. Maya unfolded the paper. She recognized the handwriting instantly. It was the elegant, cursive script she had seen in history books, the handwriting of the infamous Black Widow. She read the letter, and as she read, the monster dissolved. Isabella hadn't written a manifesto. She hadn't written a confession. She had written a love letter. My darling Leo, do not let the hate turn you into stone. The world is cruel, but you must be soft. I forgive the men who lied. I forgive the men who will kill me. They are just frightened children in costumes. I am going to the river now. I will wait for you there, in the quiet. It was the voice of the woman who had apologized to her executioner. It was the voice of a mother protecting her son from beyond the grave. And, crucially, in the margins, scrawled in haste, was a detail that shattered the state's case. The gun was not mine, Leo. It was Henri's. He was afraid of the men from Chicago. I should have told you. I was trying to protect his name. Maya published the letter in the New Orleans Times-Picayune on the 20th anniversary of the execution. The article, titled "The Apology of the Dead," hit the state like a hurricane. Historians scrambled. Lawyers reopened the files. The men from Chicago, the mob connection that had been rumored but ignored, suddenly made sense. The framing of Isabella became obvious. The incest accusation was revealed for what it was. A grotesque fabrication by a prosecutor desperate to win at any cost. Ellis Thorne, the man who had orchestrated the show trial, was still alive. He was a retired judge, living in a gated community. When the reporters came to his door with copies of the letter, he slammed it in their faces. He died a year later, alone and disgraced, his obituary noting him only as the man who executed an innocent woman. But the most profound impact was on a 28-year-old ranch hand in Texas named Lee Miller. Lee read the story in a local paper. He saw the photo of the letter. He saw the handwriting. And suddenly, the dam broke. The memories flooded back. The smell of his mother's perfume. The flashbulbs. The courtroom where he had been forced to lie. The shame that had sat in his gut like a stone for 2 decades dissolved into a torrent of grief. He wasn't the son of a monster. He was the son of a martyr. Lee drove his truck east. He drove all night, crossing the border into Louisiana as the sun came up over the bayou. He went to New Orleans. He met with Maya. He held the yellowed paper in his hands, tracing the words his mother had written in the shadow of the electric chair. She loved me. Lee wept, his tears falling onto the ink. She didn't leave me. Lee wanted to visit her grave. He wanted to bring her flowers. He wanted to tell her he had survived. He went to Angola. He met with the current warden, demanding to know where she was buried. The records were lost. The unmarked grave in the swamp was a needle in a haystack of mud and water. The landscape had changed. Floods had shifted the banks. The cypress trees had grown. Isabella Dubois had become part of the swamp. Lee rented a boat. He went out into the Atchafalaya with a bundle of white roses. He didn't know the exact spot, so he drifted. He let the current take him. In the middle of a quiet lagoon where the water was black and still as a mirror, he stopped the engine. "I'm here, Mama," he whispered. He threw the roses into the water, one by one. They floated on the surface, stark white against the darkness. "I'm soft," he said to the wind. "I didn't turn to stone." The legacy of Isabella Dubois is not in the history books of Louisiana politics. It is in the precedent of dignity. Her case became a cornerstone in the argument against the death penalty in the state. It became a case study in law schools about the dangers of trial by media. But more than that, it became a legend of the spirit. The apology to the executioner is still cited today. It is the ultimate act of defiance. By apologizing to the man killing her, Isabella refused to be a victim. She elevated herself above the violence. She turned the electric chair into a stage where she performed the final act of humanity. She proved that you can strip a woman of her crown, her wealth, her hair, and her life. But you cannot strip her of her grace. That is internal. That is untouchable. In the end, the irony is complete. The mob that screamed for her death is forgotten. Their names are dust. The prosecutor is a footnote of shame. But Isabella Dubois is remembered, not as the Black Widow, not as the witch, but as the woman who wore white to her own funeral, The woman who hummed a lullaby in the face of lightning. Sometimes on quiet nights in the Atchafalaya, the fishermen say you can hear it. Not a scream, not a plea, but a polite, gentle voice drifting over the water. Pardon me. And then, the silence returns, heavy and judgmental, waiting for the next innocent soul to test the weight of its conscience.